Welcome to the second Irwin Data Modeler Tool Training course, Building Your First Data Model. Hopefully you've taken the first course, Introduction to Irwin Data Modeler, and in that course we actually started to build our data model, but we were just using the basic on-screen techniques. As a reminder, this model is based on the sample model that is part of the Irwin DM installation publication system sample.irwin. As we continue to build our model with subject areas and diagrams, you'll become familiar with the guided editors. These guided editors unlock the real power of Irwin DM and help create content suited to the different audiences that need to understand your data model. Then we will wrap things up with an overview of the help system. In this module, we will introduce the guided editors for entities, attributes, and relationships. I remember years ago reading a review of Irwin. The reviewer, his only complaint was that there's so many editors. Well, yes, that's because Irwin has an incredibly rich variety of data model objects. And if you want to deal with those objects well, you need to have an editor for their properties. Once you've learned how to work with a few of these editors, these guided editors in Irwin DM, they're not as puzzling. We're going to find that for a given model object, the guided editor accesses all the properties for those objects. We already know that when we create an entity in an Irwin DM model, Irwin builds the physical equivalent table for that entity. What you don't know and won't find out until our advanced modeling techniques course is how adjustable that starting point physical model is. Right now it looks very similar to the logical model, but it can look very different from the logical model if you build in consistent rules. We'll see how to do that in the course on advanced modeling techniques. For now, let's begin with the guided editors by looking at the entity editor. All right, we got a little bit serious in the last couple of demonstrations. Now we're going to get a little bit more serious. I've zoomed our model out a couple of steps, and I'm going to create another entity. But first, let me make some room for it. I'd like it to be above book. Let me drag these. I lassoed and then drag these three entities down and to the right a little bit. Yeah, let me move them a little farther to the right. Just for fun, let me see what that's done, if anything, to the physical side of our model. We moved everything but that association entity, right? It pays to get a little practice moving these relationship lines around. So you can run the relationship lines however you need them, just to make sure that the lines are visible, they're not running behind other things. If you'd like to put it back where it was, point to the relationship line, give a right click, and select Reset Relationship Path. It's not quite the way I want it, but it's pretty close. Time to create a new entity. Remember in our discussion of the entities, we had one called Book YTD Sales. We know how to create entities using the Irwin DM toolbox on the diagram. We know how to create entities in the Model Explorer and tables as well. But how do we create entities and tables where we can actually get hold of all the properties of the entities, the tables, and later on attributes and columns? Well, I'm going to begin this effort back on the logical side. We're going to open the first of our guided editors called the Entity Editor. So I think a reasonable place to look for it is in the Edit menu, but I don't see any editors that are specifically targeting some model object here. Ooh, model object. Maybe they'd be under the Model menu. There we go. Model Entities. Select that. Here we have the Entity Editor. There's so many tabs in the bottom portion of this. I'm going to make this editor wider. We see the three entities that we've already created above: author, book, and publisher. The only properties that we had access to when we were doing on diagram editing was the name of the entity. But these tabs show all the properties that entities can have. They can have volumetrics properties. Entities can have definitions. They can be associated with a style right out of a theme. So we talked about themes as applying at the diagram level, which they certainly can. But for any given entity or entities in a diagram, you can override the general diagram settings with specific connection to a theme for that entity or entities. There's an icon tab where we can associate each entity with a small icon and a large icon. There's this wonderful Where Used tab. And let's see where the entity author is being used. It's used, of course, in the entity itself, and it's participating into relationships. Where used. Oh my goodness, what a valuable addition that was to Irwin DM. We'll skip UDP for a minute, go to history. The highlighted entity, author, was created, meaning it was built in this model. It wasn't reverse engineered from someplace else. It was created. Created in the model, Model 1. Remember, the model name at the top of the Model Explorer doesn't have to match the file name. By default, it won't. There is a source path if we're documenting data sources. Comment, date and time created, and the name of the creator. I can't modify this stuff. This is all created automatically. Let's take a look at notes. Transfer, event, comment, date created, created by, date modified, modified by. Look at the toolbar here. We have sort items. There's a little icon with a starburst at the top left corner. We know that means new. So I could create a new note here. And extended notes. Name, event, comment, author, importance, note status, modified time. So there's all kinds of metadata here for tracking the project that's creating this entity, the projects that are using this entity, and the whole history of the entity, besides just what's noted on the History tab. Still, with all of this metadata, there may be something that isn't recorded that you would like to be recorded. That's when you need the UDP tab. We will look at UDPs later on. User-defined properties. Well, we want to build a new entity. That's why we came here. Book YTD sales. Let's look up at the very top. This is where you'll find the toolbars. This is called the guided editor for entity. Notice we have these buttons, previous sibling and next sibling. The highlight moves to book. Next sibling, publisher. And I can back up. I can sort the entities into alphabetical order. There's a button for a new one. See the starburst? A new entity. And we have a little wastebasket where we can delete things. And a help key. Push the new button, the icon with the starburst. As expected, Irwin has created an entity for us and named it E/11. It doesn't exist yet on a diagram, but let's change that name. Not E/11, but all capitals, Book YTD Sales. You know, while we're here, let's take a look at some properties, some metadata for our entities that we can get at only in the guided editor. Select the entity author up at the top, and then select definition. Very good. What about book? And so forth. We want a definition for publisher. Your organization should have its own standards about how you define these entities, and it's amazing how much effort it takes to get people to agree. It's difficult. Is it worthwhile? I think it's immensely worthwhile. Okay. Style, icon at the entity level. For example, I've seen an organization that used the small icon to track the approval status of entities and attributes. So if they had a little red stop sign showing beside the name of the entity, that means this entity's not yet been approved by our technical committee. Well, let's click close. Wait a minute. Where's book YTD sales? Is it in the model? It is, but it's not in the diagram. That's correct. You might not want it in this diagram. A diagram represents no more than the whole subject area or model with which it's associated, but it can be less than. I would like book YTD sales to show in this diagram. So right-click, pick Add to Diagram, and there we go. Just for giggles and grins, let's take a look at the physical side. Now that we have a table named Book YTD Sales, right-click on that table and look at all the choices we have. Trigger properties, stored procedure properties, what in the world? I just want to see table properties. We will eventually, in this series of courses for Irwin DM tool training, cover lots and lots of that stuff. Once again, we have far too many tabs, so I'm going to make this box wide enough, maybe, that we can see all the tabs. Let's just look at the tabs now. We know what to expect up the top, the physical names. Interesting stuff, though. Durability, physical only tables. Entities could be logical only, by the way. Whether the table's ever going to be generated. We might have tables in our model just to reference a table that exists in some other schema, some enterprise level table. And we like to show it in the model, show it in a diagram so that we can see how it influences us. But we're not ever going to use this model to actually generate that table. So we would have to uncheck the box for such a table. Let's just go through these tabs. Look on the General tab at all of these properties. I don't know. Somebody should count these. If you told me a table can have 100 properties, I wouldn't doubt you. These are all the general properties. Partitions. Change data capture. Data compression. This model, the physical side, targets SQL Server 2016. If we were targeting Oracle, we would have a lot of different tabs up here because Oracle has some different features and different metadata that applies to tables. Validation rules, validation constraints, permissions, a comment. Oh, look at this. We already have a comment. Author is a person who writes books. Some interesting buttons over here on the left. Cut, copy, paste, restore inheritance from definition. That's grayed out right now because this comment was inherited from the definition on the logical side of the entity. Edit. So I hope you don't need the edit button for, well, you might for physical comments, but I hope you don't need it for the logical side definition. And we can spell check just this particular bit. And you're going to find that when you start out, such things as B-O-O-K lowercase s don't appear in the dictionary. Notice on the comment tab at the far upper right, update entity definition to match. Now, generally at the beginning of a modeling project, especially when we're starting on the logical side, modeling the business requirements, we don't know much about the physical side yet. There's probably a different group of people that are going to influence that. But eventually, we would want the comment on the physical side to differ probably from the definition on the logical side. In the meantime, if we make a change here on the physical side, we would like it to be reflected back to the logical side. So I'm going to check this box, update entity definition to match. Notice in our action log at the bottom left corner of Irwin Data Modeler, records even that. Set table property, update entity definition to match. Volumetrics, we had these on the logical side. Well, it makes sense. In some organizations, the logical models are built by people who are different from the people who build the physical models. And when they're interviewing the business experts, that's a good time to collect some of this volumetrics information. Style, so we can attach a theme or change fonts and fill colors and outline colors and on and on and on. Icons, didn't used to be able to have an icon on the physical side. Object creation order, this is SQL Server stuff. More where used, wonderful, wonderful. History, notes, extended notes. And if there's any properties that you would like your tables to have that you don't see here, you can create them as user-defined properties. I'm going to close the table editor. We're going to come back and look at the attribute and column guided editors in the next demo, and we'll take care of fleshing out book YTD sales at that time. We're following the same sequence here that we followed when we were doing on-screen editing, only now we're using the guided editors. Let's take a look at the attribute editor and the column editor now. Let's continue now with the guided editors. We'll be looking at the attribute editor and the column editor. But right now, I've got all these entities and tables way off here on the right side of the screen, and my Model Explorer is way back over there on the left. I'd like to move this, but I can't move it. Can't reposition it with the sliders. Let me open up the overview panel, resize it. This blue outline is outlining the workspace. So I can grab that blue outline, drag it to the right, see what's happening underneath. I can resize, reshape the blue outline. Mostly I just want to drag the blue outline over here. So I'm kind of positioning my workspace around the entities that I have now. Now to replace the overview pane where it was at the bottom left, docked, I just double click on a title bar. Back it goes. When I first dragged it up out of its position, notice we have several little controls that appear around the screen. These little blocks, little boxes with arrows in them. Those are useful to hover over the boxes if you want to reposition and dock your overview pane in some other place. But to get it back to where it was, all you have to do is double click on the title bar. Boom, there it goes. And our diagram is repositioned within the workspace. Now we're ready to continue with attribute and column editors. Our book entity certainly has more than these two attributes. How did we get into the entity editor? Well, from the model menu, there is no entity editor. There's a tables editor. What's wrong with this picture if I want to look at entities and attributes? Yes, I must be on the physical side of the model, because the contents of these menus will change depending on whether you're looking at logical or physical. Let me flip over to the logical side then. Let's look at creating some attributes for book YTD sales. And we're going to use the attributes editor to do that. Just hover your cursor over book YTD sales, the entity, right click, and look at our choices now. Entity properties, attribute properties, key group properties, on and on and on. I'm selecting attribute properties. And once again, resize so we can get the right width here for all of our tabs. We have no attributes for the entity book YTD sales. Notice that once we're in the editor, and this is common with Irwin guided editors way up at the top, we have a drop-down list. I came here by highlighting book YTD sales, but once I'm in here, I can move to any of the other entities as I like. Well, what goes up here at the top? A list of attributes with their name, their parent domain, whatever that is, a logical data type, whether they participate in the primary key or whether they're foreign key values, if they're logical only. I want to create a new attribute. Look through the toolbar and see if you can find an icon that says I'm going to make a new something. There it is. It's a little sunburst. Click on New. The name is default. Well, that's interesting. Why is the name default? Take a look on the General tab in the Attributes Editor, and you'll see a domain tree. Irwin Data Modeler's domains are one of its most incredibly powerful features. By default, if we create an attribute out on the diagram, just by clicking and typing it in, then that attribute will be associated with what's called the default domain. But what are our other choices? Binary large object, blob, date, time, number, or string. Well, it looks like the domains have something to do with kind of the category of the attribute. Well, we definitely don't want this attribute. I'm looking for a book YTD sales amount attribute. I want to create that. But it's not going to be default. If it's a sales amount, that sounds like a number. So I'm going to select the number domain on the left. And that's going to change the name of my attribute. What else is it going to change? Well, it might change the logical data type. Right now, the default type is char 18. It might even change the null option. What are these little icon buttons out to the left of each field here? These are inheritance buttons. If you left-click on one of them, you'll notice I can either inherit or override the inheritance. Inherit means this property of the attribute will be inherited through its association with the domain. So we're going to keep an eye on name of the attribute, logical data type of the attribute, and null option for the attribute when we change from the default domain for our new attribute to the number domain. Well, on the General tab, the name says it's still %ATT domain, but if you look in the list of attributes at the top, notice the name now is number instead of default. So on the General tab, we're seeing in the name field actually the macro that's going to determine the name of the attribute itself up at the top. Well, we're going to have to override that. We're going to change that. But notice our logical data type. The default was char 16. Now it's integer. And sure enough, we see it up above. The null option is still null. Why? Well, because the null option for the number domain is null. Notice in the list of attributes at the top, the name is as derived by the macro. The parent domain is number because we checked the number box in the tree at the bottom. Logical data type is integer. I'm going to change the name of number by selecting it. I want book YTD sales amount. And I'm pretty happy with all the other things. In our attribute list at the top, I could change the parent domain just in this drop-down, or I can use the tree at the bottom. We could change the logical data type. Integer is probably not a very good data type for sales amount. Let's drop that down and look at our list of logical data types. Boolean, byte, decimal, money, number. Oh, wait a minute, there's no varchar in here. In fact, that's a very short list of data types, isn't it? Yes, it is. Why? Because our list of allowable data types is being constrained by the fact that our attribute is associated to the number domain. You only see logical data types on this list if they make sense for number. So I'm just going to take money with no parentheses. Notice at the right side of the General tab near the bottom, book YTD sales amount. What's my little push button to the left of that say? See the box with a little pencil? It's been overridden. Inheritance has been overridden. What if I switch back to inherit? I'm back to number. So every one of these inheritable properties throughout this entire bunch of tabs, dozens of properties, can be inheritable through the association with the domain. I'm going to override this again. Now, I've overridden it before up in the list of attributes. I can override it down here on the General tab by selecting Override and typing in book YTD sales amount. I'm going to leave the money alone. Wait a minute about this null option. If we're trying to track the year-to-date sales of books, then the money, we're going to allow that to be null? It's ridiculous. So let me change the null option. Notice it's not shown up here in the attribute list. which still shows the attribute as being named number because we haven't committed here yet. Let me drop down a list for null options. Boom, that commits our book YTD sales amount attribute name at the top. And from the available options, I will now select not null. Watch this inheritance box button change. So the inherited value for a null option, inherited from the number domain, has been overridden here, as has the logical data type, as has the name, all overridden. The inheritance can be reestablished if we'd like, property by property, and that's true for the constraints. That's true for key groups and styles and definitions. All these things can be inherited. Even the definition of an attribute can be inherited from its domain. Where used can't be inherited. The values of any user-defined properties that you create, those can be inherited. Well, let's make another attribute without so much discussion this time. This will be book YTD sales date. Now this time I've typed in the attribute name before I've correctly selected my domain at the bottom. I can choose in the tree or I can choose in the drop-down. Let me choose in the tree just because it's more visual. YTD sales date. What domain does it look like that attribute might be associated with? Date time. Notice the name of our attribute. Since it was already present, we had already overridden the inheritance from the default domain. Thus, when we changed to the date-time domain, that inheritance stayed broken. It was overridden before, it's overridden now. Very handy, and it shows the need for the default domain. Date-time, well, that's reasonable from among the ones we had to choose. Logical data type, though. Let's use the drop-down in the list at top. Now these are all date times. Which of those do we want? Are we going to record every single transaction? We're going to record this date, totals for each day? How are we going to record this? Well, this argues for good definitions. I'm going to run all the way down and pick, there we go, timestamp. Just like it doesn't make any sense for book YTD sales amount to have a default null value of null, it also doesn't make sense to have book YTD sales date to be nullable. So I'm going to change that option to not null. Is it really book YTD sales date if we're using timestamp? I don't know. I think I'm going to change that to date time. That's book. We're going to move forward, do a few more of these, but do them much more rapidly. I want to change to a different entity. I do not have to close the editor. I can use this drop-down list at the top to flip right to book. Well, let's look at the attributes that we have already. Let's look at the properties. Book identification. Well, that sounds like number, or it could be a char 9. Let's change that to char 9. That'd be a string data type, won't it? We can take a look at our data type list, either in the list at the top, which is very narrow, or we can drop down the list down on the general tab. We're looking to make this a char 9. So I pick char paren, and I get char paren in my logical data type, but look where the cursor is blinking. Right in between the two parentheses, and I just type the number 9. Notice the book identification is marked as primary key, and the box primary key is checked, and the null option is already set to not null because we can't have null values in a primary key. Let's change book name. I'd like book name to be a varchar, variable width character field. Well, it's available for the default domain, but if we're going to inherit the value for every property of book name attribute, let's use the domains correctly. Book name is a string. The default logical data type for the string domain is varchar 20. Well, that's not enough for a book title, so I'm just going to edit that varchar 20 and make it a varchar 80. Are we going to allow a book not to have a name? I don't think so. So let's change the null option to not null. And up in the list at the top of the editor, we see that indeed book name is now associated with the string parent domain, and logical data type is varchar 80. Publisher identification. What's going on? Oh, that's a foreign key. And notice in the list at the top of the attribute editor, it's marked as a foreign key. I'm not going to change that here. I want to change it in its home position. I want to change publisher identification's domain inheritance in the entity that owns it, called the owning entity. So that's it now for book. Let's flip over to author, make some changes here. Author identification, primary key, okay. Domain, what do we want for a data type for author? I think char 9 again, so that's a string. Change the logical data type to char. Type in 9. It can't be null because it's already marked as primary key. As soon as I click outside of my logical data type field, anywhere, the value in the list up above gets updated. Author name. I don't think that's a very good attribute name. We want author last name, author first name. Let's try author last name. I want a variable with field, so I'm going to need to associate with a string domain. I get a varchar 20. That's not enough characters. Let's make a varchar 25. Finally, let's drop down our list. Let's jump to publisher. We're going to take care of that foreign key in book, too. The publisher identification. See it over in the diagram. Publisher identification. Let's drop down our domain. It's a string domain. Char 9. When you work up here in the list, this drop-down does not position the cursor as handily as it does on the General tab, so I prefer to do this work down there. And publisher name, we want a varchar 40 here, so that'll definitely be the string domain. We just have to change the value of the varchar, the maximum length, to the maximum width of the column, rather, to 40 characters. Well, we fixed publisher identification here in publisher, where it's the primary key. Let's jump back up and take a look at book. See if our foreign key issue has been fixed. And indeed it has been. So the attributes are migrating as they should, taking all their properties with them. Let's close the attribute editor and flip to the physical side of our model. Once again, in the model menu, I see tables instead of entities, but we can't access the column editor from here. Right-click on a table and pick column properties. We need to make the editor a little wider. All these panes inside here are movable, so you can reshape the interface. It is tremendously adjustable. Let's take a look at the columns and their properties here. Well, they've got domain parents assigned, physical data types, got author, author book, book, book YTD sales, and publisher. All the columns here, because of the recursive nature of Irwin, all the column properties have been what? They've been inherited from what? From the domain. Every domain has a logical side and a physical side. The logical side of that domain has all of the logical properties of an attribute, and the physical side of the domain, still just one domain object, but its physical side has values for all of the physical properties of a column. Now what you see in the physical data type is based upon the default mappings that Irwin has between logical and physical for the different DBMSs. And anything that SQL Server doesn't have that is directly matched to a logical data type will be mapped. So if this were an Oracle physical side here, the DBMS target were Oracle, we'd see a varchar 2 with a maximum width of 40 characters. There is a SQL Server tab here, and this contains lots of SQL Server characteristics, how we want SQL Server to treat these columns in a way that SQL Server treats columns. So all of these properties, all of these issues here are specific to SQL Server. If our model were targeted to Oracle or to DB2, then instead of a SQL Server tab, we'd have an Oracle tab or a DB2 tab. All the other tabs would be the same. Constraint. We don't have any constraints, but notice the checkboxes. Use inherited constraint for check constraints. Use inherited default values for default constraints. Links, that's an advanced concept, way beyond our scope right now. Indexes. Aha! Publish identification column is a primary key, so Irwin is by default going to create an index named xpkpublisher. And you say, well, that's not the way we name our indexes. Well, that's okay. In a later course, we'll see how to change this using Irwin macros. You just change it once. I want primary key indexes to be named this way, and you give it a pattern. Style, comment, where used. UDP, history, notes, extended notes. And we can go down through the whole list. And see that our physical side has been taken care of. What if we had built the physical side first? Good question. Well, the logical side and the physical side are two sides of the same coin. Irwin Data Modeler is very recursive. So if you create an object on the physical side first, well, it's going to be pushed across to the logical side as well, as long as it's a combined model. Let me close, do a file save. And our next demo will deal with relationships and a relationship property editor, another guided editor. And now we come to another guided editor, the one for editing relationship properties. Time now to look at the guided editor for relationships. The three kinds of model objects that we've created in Irwin Data Modeler using on-screen editing and the Model Explorer were entities, attributes, and relationships. And of course, we've created the physical side of entities, called tables, and the physical side of attributes, called columns. Relationships also have a guided editor. We've seen the guided editors for entities and tables, as well as for attributes and columns, but we have not yet seen the guided editor for relationships. Let's see. I want to be on the logical side of my model and take a look at the model menu. There we go, relationships. If I didn't want to use the menus, what else could I do? Well, I might right-click on an object, right? That works with entities and works with attributes and tables and columns. What if I right-click on a relationship line? One of my choices at the very top is properties. This is the relationship editor for the highlighted relationship. The relationship between author and book. There's room for a name, parent, child, logical only. We may indeed have relationships that are logical only. There's a general tab. Let's see if there are any more tabs we need to make room for. Oh yes, extended notes. That's a relatively recent addition. The relationship type, we can't change that from many to many. We can't change that to anything else in here. Relationship properties. Parent to child phrase. Well, there really isn't a parent and a child in a many-to-many relationship. But notice up at the top in our list of relationships, R1, R2, that's all we have right now, those two relationships, on the logical side. The relationship between author and book is showing parent as author. And why? Why is author shown as a parent? Because when we built that relationship line using on-screen editing, I clicked on the author entity first. And really, all of our relationships work that way. Instead of parent and child, it could have said first clicked and second clicked. But parent and child are the labels. So if author, we're going to pretend is the parent in a relationship with book, we would say that each author, writes some number of books, and at least one very broadly used standard for data modeling says that when we have these, what it calls non-specific relationships, doesn't refer to many, it calls them non-specific relationships, which I like. I mean, it's a valid thing early in the modeling process. And for non-specific relationships, to help the resolution later, it says we should record a verb phrase in each direction. Irwin allows this. Some modeling techniques do not. Irwin doesn't enforce that rule. Some modeling techniques strongly suggest that we have two. So child to parent, each book is written by. There's a definition tab. Well, how can a relationship have a definition? Well, it's got a business definition. There's business rules behind these relationships. Role name. Sometimes this concept of a role name is a solution to some modeling challenges that we'll see later. RI actions, referential integrity actions. Well, we don't have any referential integrity defined because it's a many-to-many relationship. Therefore, no trigger templates. No style associations yet, but they're available here. User-defined properties if there's just not enough metadata for you. Notes, of course. Nothing recorded. Extended notes. Style, our style tab. Wow, it looks to be taller. We're going to have to make this editor a little bit taller to see all of it. So we can assign a theme here. What's our other relationship? Now that we have the relationship editor open, let's take a look at the R/1 relationship. That's the one between book and publisher. Now in the diagram, the highlight doesn't change, but publisher is the parent, and book is the child. What about a parent-to-child verb phrase from publisher into book? Each publisher, how about produces 0, 1 or more books? Is that right? Is that the proper cardinality? Would we have records on a publisher for which we didn't sell any books? Well, maybe. It might be handy just to keep that information around for other purposes. Research, marketing. I need a relationship between book and book YTD sales. How can I make a new relationship inside the relationship editor? Do you remember? Take a look at the toolbar. You should see some buttons up there that are familiar. Next sibling, previous sibling. Sort into alphabetical order. There's a new button. I want to create a new relationship. The parent here will be book because book is tracked by book YTD sales. Is that the proper direction for the relationship? From book to book YTD sales? An identifying relationship, remember, means a foreign key is going to migrate into book YTD sales, or a primary key. Identifying relationship means that the primary key of the parent will migrate as a foreign key into the child. I'm going to go ahead and make this identifying relationship with book as the parent, book YTD sales as the child. Click OK. Highlight it in the editor here and give it a parent-to-child phrase of, I'm going to say child-to-parent phrase instead. Each book YTD sales record tracks some number of books. How many? It's really 0 or 1, isn't it? So this is an identity relationship, not just identifying. Let me go ahead and close. And it's not showing. It's not showing where? It's not showing in my diagram. Why not? Remember? Because the diagram does not have to include everything that's in the model or everything that's in the current subject area. In the entities branch of our Model Explorer, let me expand to child relations. And you see our friends R1 and R2 that, as before, those are these two. And child relations means all the relationships in which this entity, book, is a child. Well, now we have a relationship where this entity is supposed to be a parent. So let's look at parent relationships and just close up the child relations. For the entity book, parent relations include R5. I don't have an R5 showing, but right-click on it, and there's my choice of Add to Diagram. just as we saw for new entities that we created in the entity editor. And notice that our foreign key has migrated. Let's take a look at the properties of our relationships. Each book is associated with 0 or 1 book YTD sales. Not many. Well, right now, that's all that's allowed with book identification. So book YTD sales amount would be a running total. And sales date time really doesn't make any sense unless it is book YTD sales as of date time. Is that what we want? Do we want one record for book YTD sales or no records per book? Or do we want to know each and every time a copy of that book has been sold? We'll have to dig that information out. And when we do, we'll come back to our model, record it in the model, and record the reasons for it. So we've decided that it's supposed to be a record of each and every transaction with the sales amount and the date time for that book. We already have the book identification, but if we're going to have multiple amounts and multiple date times just for book identification, we can only have one value of amount and one value of date time for any given book. We need something else in our book YTD sales. We need another attribute in the primary key. Now, how do we add that? Well, we have a choice of ways to add that in. On the screen, I could add it like this. Book sales transaction number. And that allows a whole new opportunity in this relationship. See how it picked up the fork? That means many. Each book is tracked by 0, 1, or more records in book YTD sales. Where do we get this book sales transaction number? Well, that's a brand new attribute. We're going to have to open up the attribute properties editor and make some things happen. Book sales transaction number. What do you think for a domain? Number. Transaction number. Is it really a number? Because a lot of times things that are called numbers have letters in them, don't they? You see that every day. So anyway, we've got to be really picky when we're modeling data, don't we? Yeah, sales transaction number. We could just leave that as an integer. That makes sense. The default data type here makes sense for our new primary key attribute. It is part of the primary key. Book sales transaction number. We've already overridden the name inheritance from the domain because we typed this book sales transaction number name into the entity. So happy we are with the attribute book sales transaction number. Let's close the attribute editor. Flip over to the physical side and take a look at our column editor. Right-click on the book YTD sales table and pick column properties. Book sales transaction number. Let's see, the column name is just the same as the attribute name. Why? Because we have a macro for the physical name of the column that says, use the attribute name. Number domain, this is the physical side of the domain. Integer fits, so on and so forth. Good to go. Let's push close. So we've seen some properties of relationships. They have lots and lots and lots and lots of properties, just as does every kind of Irwin model object. And we've created some difficulties for ourselves just so that we have a reason to try to get out of things, like with this book YTD sales. Didn't have a very good definition of it going in, but we tried to work our way through the cardinality issues, the optionality issues. Would we track the year-to-date sales of a book that we didn't have? No. Is this supposed to be a running total, or is this a record of each and every sales transaction, but just the amount and the date time? Well, in fact, that's what we found out. Okay, well, we have worked through our basic guided editors. Our very next demo will be of the theme editor, and we will see a couple of ways to apply that to our model. Well, congratulations. Each kind of model object has its own editor, and Irwin DM has many kinds of model objects. We've looked at 3 fundamental ones here, logical side and physical side. There are many, many editors in Irwin DM, but they all look and act pretty much the same as these. It's just that the information, the details on each of the editors is different. In this next module, we will cover the theme editor. Remember that each set of diagrams is unique. They will appear either in the current subject area or when looking at the entire model. We can apply themes not only to diagrams, but to individual entities and even individual relationships. This is a convenient way to standardize the way we're overriding font and color and other kinds of settings at the diagram level. From experience, or from our first course, Introduction to Irwin Data Modeler, you should know a little bit about diagrams and themes in Irwin Data Modeler. Each diagram can be associated with a theme. Each theme is a named set of diagram properties. Themes greatly ease the work of setting up diagrams, and themes provide reusable standards for diagrams. Well, themes can also be applied to individual model objects other than the diagram. When you apply a theme to a diagram, you get properties set for lots of different model objects, but we can apply them one at a time. In this demo, we're going to take a little deeper look at the theme editor, and we're going to use it in I hope you'll find, an interesting way, always promoting reusability. Remember where to find a theme editor? We have lots of editors in the model menu, but not the theme editor. The theme editor controls the way things look, so we might look for it under the View menu, and there it is. So here's our theme editor. We have two themes, the classic theme and the default theme. Let's take a look at these tabs. We've looked at the defaults value tab before, well, at least in our first course we did. And these defaults apply to all object types, unless we set them to something else. Font options, fill options, line settings, outline settings, and diagram fill. Let's take a look at some other tabs. The Entity tab, for example. This allows us to override, for entities, the settings on the Defaults tab that we just looked at. Here on the Entity tab, we can set font options, fill options, outline options. For name display, that is whenever the entity is being displayed with its attribute names, and for definition display. We saw one of those way back when, and we'll see a definition display again. There's an attribute tab. When we apply these items from a single tab of the theme editor, whether it's to attributes or, as we just saw, entities, these would be called styles in the entity editor and the attribute editor, respectively. Here, key styles, and view and relationships and other things. And don't forget the wonderful Where Used tab. We also have the ability to define each of our themes. Okay, I'm going to cancel the theme editor here. Now, how might we use these individual styles, say for entities? Well, there are a lot of reasons we might want to draw attention to particular entities. For example, some entities have children, but no parents. In terms of entities depending on other entities, these parentless entities can be considered starting point entities. Starting point entities are very important. If we don't get them right, well, it's hard to get anything right, because all the other data, all the other entities have some dependency on the starting point entities. So it would be handy if we had a real quick way of assigning the entity styles to starting point entities. There are other ways to do this. For example, if I right-click on Publisher, there's a selection, Override Fonts and Colors. And here I could change the entity fonts and colors, change the font options, the fill options, the outline options, as well as attribute, because attributes are contained in the entities, and how we want keys to be displayed. Back on the Style tab, we have the ability to set entity style, attribute style, key style, all right here, by picking a theme for default font and color options. As you saw before, in the theme editor, when we set up defaults on the Default tab in the theme editor, those defaults get applied to every object that they can apply to. Notice local overrides to theme. So here's one place we can change the style, just by selecting a theme. That's not going to change the entire diagram. It's just going to change the style of this one entity. Let me cancel from this. Another way we could attack the same problem or the same challenge is to right-click on Publisher or Author and select Entity Properties. Here, there's another tab labeled Style. The nice thing about using the Entity Properties Editor is that we can set up one entity and then set up another entity. Click, click, click. So if you have several to do in a diagram, it's very handy. First thing we need to do, though, is to create a theme. So let me cancel out of the Entity Editor and open up from the View menu our Theme Editor. I want to make a new theme. Do you remember how to do that using the guided editors? There's a New button. Give that a click. I'm going to name my new theme Starting Point. The only thing I'm going to change about Starting Point is the entity fill color. That's here in the 5th column. Name, default font, diagram fill, nope. Entity font, nope. Entity fill, that's it. And in Starting Point theme, push the little paint bucket button. I want the fill style to be a solid color. And the fill color, well, let's see, Starting Point. Some nice light green, I think. Zero transparency. Close. There we have our Starting Point style. The only thing that's different about the Starting Point style from our default theme is the color of the entity fill. Now I'll close. We actually have two Starting Point entities here. It's not real clear from the logical side of the model, but if we switch over to the physical side, you'll see that we have resolving the many-to-many relationship between book and author. We have this association table on the physical side, book, author. So really, author doesn't have any parent, and neither does publisher. So let me switch back to the logical side and open up the Entity Editor since I want to change more than one at a time. Let me move this so we can see publisher, but I've got an ulterior motive here also. We're in the Entity Editor, so we'll be making changes to the entity. We're looking at publisher. And in our theme drop-down, we now have a third one, the Starting Point that we just defined. Notice as soon as we apply it in the editor, and this is true for guided editor behavior throughout Irwin Data Modeler, as soon as I change the fill color, it shows immediately on the screen. Let me drag my entity editor down. It's not showing on author yet because we have not applied it to the author entity. So in the list at the top of the entity editor, pick author. And once again on the Style tab, change the theme to Starting Point. And close. Now all we changed was fill color. But if we had other changes to make, I think you can see that the theme would be an efficient way of doing this. The nice thing, even for a simple change like color, we're going to use themes with our diagrams later on, but we'll hold off for a little while until we dig a little bit deeper into the diagram editor. I'm sure that you can imagine how that will go. Good for that demo. Let me save our work. And that's it for the demo. We've been doing some serious work with Irwin Data Modeler, and now we have a strong start on our first little data model in Irwin Data Modeler. Well done. Now that we have a basic entity relationship model, we'll start adding some structure and functionality that will be an enormous help as our model grows. We're familiar with subject area behavior. We're just going to get some hands-on experience with it now. We'll begin with the ability of the subject areas to focus our work, focus our attention just on a subset of the model. Aha! It looks like someone sneaked in overnight and added some entities. Note the annotation they've added. That's nice. We've got a note and an outline of these new entities. Wonder what all this light red fill color means. Well, if they did that right, we should be able to trace it, correct? We can right-click on an entity, one of these light red filled ones, and select Override Fonts and Colors. And look at the Style tab. Nothing there. Well, where else can we look? Let's look under Themes. View, Themes. There we go. The Endpoint theme has this light red fill color. Another place we can look, of course, is the Entity Properties Editor. Right-click on one of the red-filled entities and pick Entity Properties. And there we see it on the Style tab. What do they mean endpoint? Remember, we decided to use a green fill for entities that have children but no parents. And we call them starting point entities. We said everything depends upon these. Well, here's the other end of that. We've identified what we can call endpoint entities. These are entities that have parents but no children. And what's that mean? Well, these entities, the ones that are filled in red, light red, are dependent, very heavily dependent on other entities. And notice what else. Look at the entities that have that blue gradient fill. Store name, book, purchase order, order item, order shipment. This is the result just of using the hierarchical automatic layout. But when we color code effectively, look how this points out the central issues in this model. The central issues being book and probably purchase order. I think we need a couple of subject areas to focus our attention. First, I'm going to create a subject area called orders. I'm going to put all this new stuff into that new subject area. And then I'm going to create a subject area for book or books. Okay, where do we find a subject area editor? Lots of model property editors under the model menu. And there is subject areas. Let's go to it. Let me move the editor over here on the left. It's familiar to us, having seen many other guided editors so far in Irwin Data Modeler. Look at the General tab. There's a place to put an author's name. So notice the Members tab says there are no available objects. Well, here's a screen full of them. I haven't created a new subject area yet. So you need to be familiar with that behavior, and it is consistent throughout Irwin Data Modeler. We know how to make a new something. There's our little sunburst button up in the toolbar. New. There we go. Now we've populated members. Let's title this subject area Order. Auto-populate would put everything in the model into this subject area. I don't want to do that, first of all, and second of all, that's not the fun way. We also have a box on the Members tab near the top right, automatically populate with all model objects. No, we don't want to do that either. If we jump back to the General tab for a moment, now we could type in the author's name or initials. We could apply a special theme to this whole subject area. There's a Definition tab. Who thought this subject area was a good idea and why? And there's a User-Defined Properties tab, which we'll learn a lot more about later on. On the Members tab, this is about order, right? If we check that logical box, the box in the logical column, what we're going to have in our subject area is only the entity, the logical side. So I have to click and control click back order, order item, order shipment, purchase order. I think that's it. Now let's push that right pointed arrow, the single headed arrow. There we go. And let's close the subject area editor and see what we have. Pretty much nothing. Take a look at the title bar so we can find out where we are. We're in the same model. We're in a subject area called Order, and we're on diagram ER diagram 642. In the Model Explorer, little review here. Down at the bottom, select the Subject Area tab. And in a list at the top, you see, well, we're highlighted on Order. Let's look at the Entities branch in the Order subject area. Well, our subject area does have these 4 entities, but they're not being displayed on this display. Can you remember how this separation works from the model to the subject area to the diagrams? We can actually grab these, drag them over, and drop them on top of the diagram. So we want to work on this diagram. Right-click the background, pick Properties. There we go, ER diagram 642 in this new subject area. Let's take a look at the Members tab. Order item, order shipment, purchase order. We've got back order already. We want all 3 of these that are in our subject area now included in the diagram, so push the double-headed right-pointing arrow and close at the bottom right. Let's try hierarchical layout. Well, that's something. That's really not everything we wanted, is it? And Irwin has created for us the model subject area at the top. Try to think first of subject areas and only then of diagrams. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 entities in the subject area, the new entities that we're trying to add to our order subject area, and we only got 4 of them. Pull up the subject area again. I'm going to take these 4. I shift-clicked because I wanted everything from the top to the bottom. And on the included object side, I'm going to push the left-pointed arrow to move these temporarily back to the available object side. This time, as they come through, there's our 4. Back order, order item, order shipment, and purchase order. This time I want to use that spanning neighborhood button. It's the one that looks like it's unifying things. Move selected objects and neighboring objects to included. Well, let's push that neighborhood button. Spanning neighborhood, ancestors, descendants. And it says add checked items to subject area order, but this is a check mark on the left side of the columns, not that logical checkbox that was on the right. Okay, well, they're all still vaguely highlighted in a light gray color. In the ancestors box up at the top left, I'd like to have the selected entities plus all of their ancestors, parents, grandparents, and so forth. Plus, I'd like to have all of their descendants. Now push the add button at the bottom. Ooh, I think we got a lot of things we don't want. Let's see what we have. Once again, we have to go to the diagram and move everything in from the subject area, copy everything from the subject area to our diagram, pick a hierarchical layout. No, we've got way too much stuff here. We need to edit the subject area. There are a couple of ways of doing this. We can go back to the subject area editor in a model menu and put away the ones that we don't want, take them from the included side to the available side. And there's another thing we could do that hints at the upcoming demonstration. It's region, store name. Now, I don't want region. Let me select it and delete it. Now I'm warned. The deletion of the selected objects should remove them from the current subject area or delete them from the entire model. This is what I said earlier. This is going to be the topic of our next demonstration, how the subject areas can restrict our actions to one subject area at a time. Well, I just want them removed from the current subject area, but not right now. Let me push the cancel button. Let me instead go to the diagram and control-click on the entities that I do not want in my order subject area. Well, how do I know which ones belong here? Well, there's no such thing. I mean, it's to be determined in the eye of the beholder, right? There, I've clicked and control-clicked on region, store name, publisher, book. Now let me hit the delete button on my keyboard. Do you want them deleted from the model? No. A little bit different dialogue here. Let me zoom to fit this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Those are the 8 that I really wanted. Do you see how this diagram now tells its own story? I almost got into trouble with these diagrams. Let me give us a better name than the default name, ER Diagram 6FAR2. I'm just going to rename that as logical. Remember how to open the diagram editor? You can just right-click on the diagram, which means the background. So now we have an order subject area. But notice in the Model Explorer, we're on the subject area tab for the subject area order up at the top. I deleted those entities from the diagram, not the model. And where else did I not delete them? I didn't delete them from the subject area, but that's really what I want. I want to delete publisher and region, royalty history, and store name. So right-click on publisher, select delete, and now I'll be removing them from the current subject area. The way I can give you to help you remember what's going on here, when we were working directly with the diagram, the effect of our actions affected that one diagram. And the dialogue was very clear. It said, do you want to delete these from the diagram or from the whole model? It didn't say anything about subject areas. But when we work with the Model Explorer for a particular subject area, now we will be affecting the subject area. And, by the way, remembering that hierarchy, the paradigm of model subject area diagram, If we delete something from the subject area, what happens to it in all of the diagrams for that subject area? Yes, gone. So the deletion of the selected object should remove them from the current subject area, not the model. Goodbye, publisher. Goodbye, region. Goodbye, store name. Goodbye, book. Any others? No, I think we finally got our subject area the way we want it. And we went about that the hard way so that we could see some interactions between diagrams, subject areas, and models. We're going to build another subject area next, and we're going to go about it the right way so that you can see how everything works out quickly. Let us return to the model in the Model Explorer. Nothing happens just by clicking the Model tab. We're still looking at our subject area over here. Well, there's no need to go back to the Model tab of this Model Explorer because up at the top of our Subject Area tab, we have a choice for Model. There we go. Okay, now I would like to remove from this diagram. Note the subject area called Model is surrounded by brackets, angle brackets. Why? To draw attention to the fact that this subject area represents the entire model. So if we remove something, an entity, for example, from this subject area titled Model, it will be gone from the entire model. And that is not what we want. What we do want is to remove it from this diagram. We're going to remove these entities inside the outline here from this diagram. While we're at it, let's rename this diagram. And I won't talk you through that just to see if you can remember the steps. Customer, purchase order, I'm control clicking. Discount, order item, book return, order shipment, royalty history, back order. Wait a minute, is this the right way to do this? I don't think so. I think I want this diagram to represent everything in my model. I mean, the diagram is associated with the model subject area. What I really need here is the ability to focus my attention on orders, but also to focus my attention on books. I need another subject area. So pull down the model menu and select subject areas. We're going to build a new subject area, and we're going to call it book. We can work as we did before, clicking and control clicking everything that has the word book embedded in its name. This assumes, of course, that our entities have been carefully named, but you can have some other criteria. And then using the spanning neighborhood button, all ancestors and all descendants. Let's just try this, see what we get, and include them on the right. Are there any things that we don't want? Well, we don't want back order. We don't want order item. Don't want order shipment. Anything we want that we didn't get? Well, let's close. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's close our subject area editor. Right-click the background, select the diagram properties, edit diagrams in book. Okay, we're just going to rename this diagram. Why not call it logical? And on the Members tab of the diagram editor, we've done this all before. Let's push the double-headed arrow to get all the available objects, the ones that are in this book subject area, into our new logical diagram. Notice the title bar again way at the top of Irwin Data Modeler. We have the name of the model, the name of the subject area, and the name of the diagram. Okay, now close the diagram editor. Lay this out again hierarchically. That's the one I've been using so far. Book return and royalty history. They don't have any connections to anything else on this page, and they're endpoint entities. So they're really important. Remember, that's what the red fill color means in our little world here, our class standards. So they depend on other things a lot. We don't want them here. We want to see what they depend upon, since they are so dependent. Well, let's jump over to that other subject area, order. There's book return and royalty history, and they are connected. Is this where they belong? Well, they both depend upon order item, which depends upon purchase order, which depends upon customer. It's interesting how the starting point entities, customer and discount, result eventually in book return, back order, and royalty history, just by looking at the flow of the data. So order subject area looks the way we want it, but the book subject area, book return, royalty history, we don't want. Where does this problem lie? Is it just with this tab? No, it's not with the diagram. The problem is with our subject area. Book return and royalty history don't belong in the book subject area because they're not connected to anything else, assuming this has been properly modeled. So, Model Explorer, subject area tab, right-click on Book Return, and select Delete. Remove from the current subject area, not from the entire model. I like the word remove. And royalty history, right-click, delete. Okay, zoom to fit. This is our book subject area. Let me do the hierarchical layout again. Oh, it looks pretty good. There's a lot of squiggly lines in here, though. Let me show you a wonderful layout option. Select all of these with Control A. And now in the layout toolbar, the button that's second from the right, the tooltip is Reset Relationship Paths. Give a click. Oh, isn't that nice? It didn't move any of the entities, but look how it cleaned up those lines. Good stuff. This is book. Let's take a look at our other subject area, order. I wonder if I can straighten out these lines. Control A to select all. The shorter and straighter we can keep our relationship lines, the easier the diagram is to understand at first or second reading. It's important, though, to cover this isolation. We can remove something from a diagram but leave it in the subject area. We can remove something from the subject area, but of course still leave it in the model. Or we can say, when I say delete, I mean delete. It's gone. It's gone from the diagram. It's gone from the subject area. It's gone from the model. And that will be gone. However, all is not lost because we have our what? Our action log. This is just the actions that I've taken in this modeling session. It remembers everything. It remembers when I moved things. It remembers when I laid the model out. But then double-clicking on the action log title bar will place it right back where it was docked. Very good. I'll see you for the next demonstration. Next, we'll see how subject areas can restrict the scope of our actions to just that subject area. We'll continue to work with the subject area editor and the whole concept of subject area, as well as diagrams, and as well as the overall model. This is why we spent some time earlier in the course discussing this model, subject area, diagram, hierarchy, or paradigm. We had some difficulties. I think the main difficulty was in building our new subject areas was just in keeping track of things. Maybe we should have made a list. Well, we can actually use this behavior of Irwin Data Modeler to help us to build a list, in fact. What behavior am I talking about? The behavior of limiting action to a subset of a model, or in fact, to an individual diagram. Let me show you the problem we wind up with. Our friend who added our new entities last night left two of them out. One entity named region and an entity named store name. Where do they belong? In the subject area about books? No. They're not connected to anything in books. They are connected to purchase order. Let's use this behavior, this isolation of our actions. Let's use that to help you build a new subject area and to keep you on track. We're going to pretend for a moment that we're just now building that new subject area called order. Where am I now? Well, I'm looking at the model subject area. I'm looking at the entire model, really. But it's the model subject area that has our logical tab. We have logical tabs in the other subject areas, too. It looks like our friendly Irwin Data Modeler didn't quite get the annotation correct. The red line should have included region and store name. Here's a way to build subject areas, or in fact diagrams, that will use this limiting action of subject areas and diagrams to assist you greatly. I'm going to build a new diagram. I'm in the model now. Diagram menu, new diagram. And I'm going to right-click, change the properties, make the title work area. And I'm not going to put anything here yet. Let me close. We've seen a couple of ways to populate diagrams. Well, here's another way. On the Logical tab, I'm going to use my cursor to lasso everything that's covered by the annotation, plus region and store name. I could have control-clicked. Now from the Edit menu, or just using the hotkey combination Control-C, I'm going to copy, switch diagrams to the work area diagram, and from Edit, paste. Now zoom to fit. We didn't get all the annotation. I must have missed a corner of it when I was lassoing. Well, this is kind of what I want for my new subject area. I don't want that annotation over here. Let me get rid of that. Select it and delete. I wonder if I could build a new subject area. Let me try Model, Subject Areas, New. I'm going to call this one Test, and close. We're in the Test subject area. I can see that in the title bar, and I can see it in the drop-down at the top of Model Explorer on the Subject Area tab. Let's go back to the model where we just made our temporary work area display. These are the entities I wanted in my order subject area. So I'm trying a new approach here, using the diagram and using this isolation capability. What I do in one subject area doesn't affect other subject areas. And from the Edit menu, I see Selection. I can select all with Control-A on the keyboard. Let me copy these items, Control-C, and switch over to my Test subject area and paste them, Control-V. Yes, well, look at that. Somehow we need to isolate these entities that we want to populate into our new subject area. With the subject area editor, we saw that we had these various capabilities of moving things back and forth between the list on the left of available objects, the list on the right of included objects, including the very fancy Spanning Neighborhood tool. And these things are incredibly useful, especially if you're working with a model that's new to you, if it's the result of some big reverse engineering project. It's an unfamiliar model and you're just trying to get some understanding of it. But remember, what we do in one subject area does not affect the other subject areas. It might affect the model, for example, the deletion, whether we want to remove something from a subject area or delete it from the model. You better have that straight, the difference between a model and a subject area. Also, deleting something from being displayed on one of these diagrams doesn't affect any of the other diagrams, or it doesn't affect the subject area. Well, here, in fact, in the subject area editor, we see that the items we simply copied and pasted from a different diagram in a different subject area into this diagram of this test subject area, they're now members, first of all, of the diagram, obviously, but anything that's a member of the diagram has got to be a member of its containing subject area. Understanding the hierarchy of model, subject area, diagram in both directions is vitally important. We already had these entities nicely laid out back here in our logical model. And we saw just by clicking, we created a new diagram. This is in the model. And we copied the things that we wanted to build a new subject area around from the logical diagram of the model into this work area diagram of the model. Just copy and paste. And from there, I think this is a good process to follow. Rather than working directly from the bigger diagram, I would rather make a working area like this. Once again, we just copied and pasted into our new subject area called test. We do still have one fix to make. I don't want to confuse you with the green and red color coding. The starting point and end point entities just gives a story to tell, to tie all this work together. It helps tell a story, and it very much does point out the hierarchical layout. There is a tendency for these starting point entities to bubble up to the top or down the left side. And there's a tendency for the endpoint entities to wind up across the bottom and up the right side using the hierarchical layout button. So even without color coding, the hierarchical layout has this tendency. So our topic here in the second demo of this module was to talk about how subject areas limit action to the currently active subject area. Or at least they allow us, they warn us if we're about to do something that's going to step beyond the boundaries of the current subject area. Now you've seen me have some hands-on practice with the subject area editor. It has some really wonderful capabilities. Well, we're starting to have an Irwin data model. We began with some simple entities, tables, attributes, columns, and relationships. Most recently, we've added some specific Irwin data modeler features to our model. We've built a couple custom themes just for use with entities. Those themes are limited, only have the entity fill color in them. We didn't do much. We've built a couple of subject areas. Now that we have that stuff to work with, let's continue by learning to work with the diagrams using the diagram editor. We'll begin by taking a look at all the tabs and all the properties available to us on the diagram editor, and then we'll work with our two new subject areas, book and order, and create some new diagrams in them. Once we have those diagrams constructed, we'll see how we can move them around within the subject area in the workspace and aim for consistency from one subject area to another, and also have it make logical sense to you while you're navigating. So we'll begin with all those tabs. Well, here we are where we kind of left off in the previous module. Remember, we created a temporary work area diagram to enable us to look at the overall model and select the members for our other two subject areas, make sure they're accounted for. Let's take a look at the diagram editor. Lots of objects in Irwin Data Modeler can be accessed by right-clicking some other object. So if we right-click, for example, on an entity, we have a lot of choices. Entity properties, that brings up the entity guided editor. Attribute properties, key group properties. If we right-click on a relationship, we can open up properties. This is the guided editor for relationships. Well, the diagram is really all of this, including the background. So one way to access the diagram guided editor is by right-clicking the background and picking properties. The other way, of course, is with the diagram menu. Let's start at the top and work down. Once again, a feature that we have in just about every guided editor. Edit ER diagrams in what? This is the model. Or we can jump to book, order, test. So once we get into this, we don't have to leave the editor, go someplace else in the diagram. We can work right from here. Very, very handy. Working from the top down, we can move backward and forward in our list from sibling to sibling. We can sort the list into alphabetic or reverse alphabetic order. We can create a new diagram, the little button with the starburst. We have a trash can to use for deletion. We have a very interesting button. Notice the tooltip. Harden, override, or restore inheritance of drawing styles. Wonder what harden means. Well, the key here is inheritance. A diagram inherits settings from its associated theme, if any. An entity, another example, can inherit its properties, its display properties, if you will, either from the diagram that it's part of, or by having a separate style attached directly to the entity, or by right-clicking and changing the object fonts and colors. Well, if the fill color, because that's the one we've used so far, if the fill color, for example, is being inherited from the diagram properties, and then I change it, I don't want it to be inherited anymore. We're breaking inheritance on purpose. Of Of course, perhaps we'll do something to restore inheritance, and we don't want that to happen in our fill colors for these entities. Remember the starting point and ending point entities that we're playing with. So we could tell the diagram editor to harden all styles to prevent any changes, meaning changes by inheritance. Not just by inheritance, but any manual changes. We can override all styles so that no inheritance of anything happens, or we can remove style overrides and restore inheritance to everything. We're going to see this activity, this action capability in a lot of different places in Irwin Data Modeler. And of course we have the help button. Notice the filter text box near the top right corner of our diagram editor. Enter filter text. And I'm going to try PHY. Uh-oh, what happened to my diagrams? It says there are no items to show. None of our diagram names match PHY. Might be handy if you have a lot of diagrams. In our list, we have logical and work area. Work area was temporary. Don't think we need it anymore. So let's select the work area diagram and push the delete button in the toolbox. And it's gone. The General tab has space for author's name or initials. That's handy. An optional theme, so we can attach or associate a theme to this diagram. And then optional override to theme background fill. We actually have two ways to use themes now to fill the background. Either the theme directly, and if we have that set up from the theme, that background color inheritance or style inheritance, then we can set up a secondary optional override to the background fill. Okay, second tab, members. We've looked at this before, and handily, the members tab here in the diagram properties editor is almost identical to the one in the subject areas editor. Available on the left, included on the right. An option to automatically populate the diagram from the model. Relationships. Oh, so members is all about entities. We don't have to show all of the relationships on the diagram in which those entities participate. I've seen this put to some interesting uses in designing conceptual models. On the Layout tab, number of properties about model layout or diagram layout. Manual layout, we can allow it or disallow it by unchecking. The default is to have these boxes checked. Manual layout of the relationships and manual resizing of the entity. We can create a grid, an alignment grid, so that our objects all kind of line up along that grid. That requires a checkbox. We need a grid spacing and a grid color. The grid's going to have little dot kind of markers on it. So we could create a grid and then go back to the diagram and not see the grid. Why? Well, because we have visual cues down here at the bottom. Show page grid. And this is common, that we'll have the ability to set something up, but then we have to set its visibility also. By default, show background and show callout are both checked. Callouts are just little explanation boxes that could be attached to a relationship. Selection grips, little handles when we click on an entity, the little handles that we see in the corners and the middle of each side. Those handles are also called grips, and we can set their color here. That's the Layout tab. The Display tab, how we want some things displayed, or if we want them displayed at all. There are drop shadows around our entities. If I move this out of the way here for a moment, you see we've got a shadow. That box is checked. Shadow offset right and shadow offset bottom. The shadows are 5 pixels. They're set to 5 pixels to the right and 5 pixels to the bottom. So you could have narrower shadows or wider shadows. You could have them on other sides. Display length. We need to have some limitations on display length of a couple of kinds of displays. These are texts. Otherwise, we'll wind up with a line that is too long, it should have been wrapped, and so forth. So we can define a maximum length, 40 characters, for definitions and comments. We haven't seen those yet, but we will in a little bit. And we can set a maximum length, the default is 30 characters, for view expressions. This is a created view column. Options about how we want the relationship displayed. The line orientation is set to orthogonal. We could change it to diagonal. Display dangling relationships, and that's very interesting. The way subject areas work and the way diagrams work, we could have a parent entity without its child, or we could have a child entity without its parent. Well, what about the relationship line that would be connecting them if they both appeared? If only one parent or child is on the diagram or in the subject area, but we'd like to note that relationship, that's called a dangling relationship, we can decide to display it here. Split verb phrase. This is all about especially many-to-many relationships where you'll likely have two different verb phrases, one for each direction. But whenever you have one verb phrase from a parent to child and a different verb phrase from child to parent, you'd like to display them together with a slash mark between. But if you'd rather have them split and reposition the verb phrases near the appropriate ends of the relationship line, you can check this box. Display the child to parent verb phrase, display the parent to child verb phrase. Either one, neither one, or both. Subcategory cardinality. Subcategory is a special kind of non-relational relationship. It's a hierarchy. Supertype, subtype, you may have heard that term. And the cardinality of those relationships is 0 or 1. They're identity relationships. But you can choose to display that if you want. Preferences, display lines on top. And that means on the top layer of the diagram. So if we have some entities and relationships, and I draw an annotation box around them, the entities will be on the top layer, and then my box, my annotation box, drawing object box, just beneath the entity layer, and the relationships are going to be behind my annotation, so they won't show. Well, it's handy to be able to do that. There's also a send to back and send to front when we're working with those drawing objects. But here's a way to set up the default for the display. I think we can pick up some speed here on these next few tabs. The Entity tab. Lots of whether or not you want these things to be shown kind of checkboxes. By default, Display Migrated Attributes is checked, so we'll see foreign keys. And Display Logical Foreign Key Designation will also have that checked by default. The table is just the other side of the coin that we call entity/table in Irwin DM. Very similar options to the entity, although they're in table wording here. View means database view. A view might refer to a single table, or it could combine columns from several tables, complete with a join statement and all of that. Our options about views. Not much concern when we only have a logical diagram. Relationship options. Display relationships as an option. You might open a diagram someday and it's full of entities or tables and no relationships. Well, maybe the relationships are there. You can always find them, if they exist, in the Model Explorer. So they might exist but not be shown, and this is where to go investigate. Logical display options for relationships and physical display options for relationships. Notice there's a Relationship tab and a Relationships, plural, tab. Take a look at those. Relationships is a list of all the relationships that are included in this diagram. The singular named tab, Relationship, applies to how do we want each and every relationship to be displayed by default, can be overridden, But how do we want it to be displayed in this diagram? Page setup, page size, orientation, print border. Of course, you have access to this every time you try to print, but it's pretty handy to have some defaults already created in your diagram. Page setup margins, very different for different sizes. Different printers have different capabilities. Definition. Now this definition would refer to the diagram. That can be handy. We might type a definition for our logical diagram tab in case that's not immediately obvious to anyone. That's just how you do it. Our wonderful Where Used tab. Right now it's used in a model. And with all of those properties, property after property, if there are properties that you don't have or that IrwinDM does not provide, but you wish you had, user-defined properties will fill in that blank. So you might have a user-defined property, for example, who created this diagram and why and when. Interesting tabs. Let's create some new diagrams in those new subject areas. Now that we have a more thorough understanding of the Diagram Properties Editor, let's put together a new diagram or two. We're in the Model Explorer Subject Area tab. Right now we're in the Order subject area. There's one diagram already. It's called Logical. I'd like to make two more diagrams. To edit the diagram that's already here, I can right-click and launch Properties. But to build a new diagram, that gets us a new diagram, which I can now edit. What if I were already in the Diagram Properties Editor? There's a new button up there. Yes, indeed. That builds a new diagram for us. So it's very handy when you're inside these guided editors to be able to move to another primary object. When we create a new diagram, just as when we create a new relationship, when we create a new entity, create a new table, until we type in our name for that object, Irwin assigns a default name. I'm going to rename our new ER diagram, call it Physical. On the General tab, let's drop down our Themes list, and I'm going to select the Classic theme. Let's take a look at our Members tab and see what we want to belong here. We have a list of available objects. Oh, these are all entities. And we're building a diagram called Physical. Aha. The second column in our list of diagrams at the top is View Mode. We're going to change that from Logical to Physical. Okay, we're going to take all of these available objects, and that's with a double-headed arrow. They're all included. Relationships. Well, we want to see all the relationships. Layout. I think we'll accept the defaults here. Display. We'll accept the defaults here also. No, I think I want to make a change. I don't want to have drop shadows. I'll just turn those off. On the Entity tab. Well, why would I want to set options for entities when I'm going to have a physical diagram? Well, the name of the diagram won't prevent us, once we're looking at the diagram, it won't prevent us from switching back for a moment to look at the logical. So in case you're going to be flipping back and forth from logical to physical, it's handy to have some entity information. We'll leave the defaults. Table. I'm going to ask for a column data type, and I'm also going to ask for the column null option, and I'm going to ask for alternate key designator. Views. We don't have any views as yet, but we'll take the defaults. The display of an individual relationship, well, we'll take the defaults here. Page setup. We'll leave that alone. Margins, definition. I think definitions are a good idea, especially where something can be misunderstood. Although I need the typing practice, I'm not going to spend time to do it. Where used, and user-defined properties. Let's close this and see what we have. We'll have to physically click on our physical tab. And let's again select hierarchical layout. Fit to screen. And I think we have it. Probably need to lay out the relationship lines again, so I'll do a Control-A to select all, and then push that little layout button. So there's our nice new physical tab. Physical diagram. Let's go back to logical. Just look at the difference in the appearance. Physical is showing the column data type. It's showing the column null options. We've left that out of our logical diagram, but we could include those things. They'd be logical data types and so forth. I want to build one more diagram. Remember, you can use diagram, new diagram, or you can right-click and bring up the editor. We're going to need that anyway, right? And make a new diagram. We'll name this one Definition. It will be logical view and everything I like on a general tab, the members tab. Oh, what do we want in the members tab? Well, what's in our logical tab? Everything except region and store name. All right. I'm going to trick the selector here. I'm going to push everything over to the right. And then I'm going to double click on region in the included objects list. That'll move it. And store name. Relationships, these are the ones we want included in the diagram. So members refers to entities, and the relationships plural tab refers to which relationships do you want shown in the diagram. Oh, we'll accept the layout, display, that's all right. We're going to make a change on the entity tab. Display level at the top. Right now it says logical display level is attribute. Drop down the choices. We're going to work with these later on in this course, but it's interesting to know what the possibilities are at this time when we're playing with diagrams. I'm going to pick a definition display level, and I'm going to take everything else as defaults. Bottom right corner, I'll push the close button, and lay out hierarchically. Oh, this is the meaning of definition display level. Control A and use the layout button to straighten up the lines. Well, customer used to have a green fill color, didn't it, on our logical tab? It did. What about on our physical tab? It does there too. But not on our definition tab. So these fill colors get interfered with when we change the display level. We know how to change stuff back though. Going to right click on customer, select override fonts and colors. Entities will have a fill option, fill color. See the little button to the side of fill option? That's an inheritance button, isn't it? I just tried to change the fill option here. Entity fill style. No style specified. It's being overridden. Click on that little inheritance button. And I'm going to select override. Ta-da! Look, I told you we'd see these inheritance buttons all over the place. All of these settings can be inherited. So where are they being inherited from? They're being inherited from the diagram. They're being inherited from a theme. Lots of places. Now remember, I warned you before. Definition display is a separate set of settings for our font and fill color and the outline also. Definition display. I have to do that one all by itself. Solid, light green, and close. Overridden, both of those. Let's see, what were our other starting point entities, discount, and our endpoint entities, book return, royalty history. We'd want to go through and change all of those. If the lines are straight, the diagram's more easily understood. This is a very interesting way to review, especially if you have people who are not used to reviewing entity relationship diagrams. Plus, when we see a name, we assume that everybody thinks the same meaning to that name that you and I think, and it may not be so at all. Well, that's our order subject area. You know, before we leave this, definition is definitely logical side. I'd rather have definition in between logical and physical diagrams along the tabs, because I can imagine I'm going to have 6 or 7 of these tabs by the time I'm done. I'm just going to grab by pointing and left pressing to definition, slide it to the left a little bit and drop it, and it works just like Excel. Now our tabs are logical, definition, physical. By the way, physical is the classic theme. Okay, that's it for order. Let's go take a look at book and see all the nice new tabs we have there. No, we don't have any tabs. When you create diagrams, they're created within that subject area, and that subject area only. So if we check the model subject area, no new tabs. Check the test subject area, no new tabs. The only place where we have our nice new definition tab and physical tab is in the order subject area. So we've got a new diagram, and we've also played with laying out. Did a little simple change of order of sequence of our tabs. Just drag and drop. Finally, we'll see how to rearrange tabs in recent releases of Irwin Data Modeler. I think you're going to really like the way we do it now. Just grab them and move them. So reviewing our work, we've added a physical diagram and a definition diagram to our subject area called order. Let's see how that might have affected the subject area named book. Not at all. So the diagrams are isolated from each other. A set of diagrams belongs to either to the model or to its subject area. Back to order subject area. The tabs on these diagrams, I don't like the order. I wish I had thought to build the definition tab right after I built the logical tab, but I didn't. So what I need to do now is to rearrange the order of these tabs. Well, there's a very simple solution. Just grab hold of the definition tab with your left mouse button, press and hold it, and drag definition to its more logical place in between logical and physical. And that's all there is to rearranging tabs. It works just like Microsoft Excel. Remember, the only things that we can work on directly graphically in the workspace are diagrams. We can work with subject areas and we can work with the entire model using the Model Explorer, but of course that's not graphical tools. The only thing we have access to, or through, if you will, using our graphics tools, are the diagrams. That's why they're important. In this module, let's take a look at the View Editor. Database views are important data model objects that we haven't seen before in Irwin Data Modeler. Following our approach for tables, columns, and relationships, we'll begin with on-screen creation of views. Then we'll dig into the guided editor for views. Let's take a look now at the View Editor. Here we are in our friend Irwin Data Modeler. I want to open the View Editor. Where can I find that? Under Model, maybe? There we go, Views. Not all the editors can be found in the model menu, but many of them can. Here we see the familiar structure of Irwin's guided editors. It's like we've seen before in this course. And we see views that already exist in our model. V Author Privacy, V Publisher Book. Let's create a new view using the New button. We'll title it simply V _ Book. Going to be a very simple view just to get the feeling of the editor here. Take a look at the names or the labels on some of these tabs. Select, From, Where, SQL. The Select tab, even after I click on it to commit my new view, Select tab is empty. Available tables and views and Selected on the right, nothing there. We're going to have to go to the From tab first and pick one or more tables, which are going to serve as the base for our view. I'm going to keep this very simple. So on the left, I pick Book, and I push it to the right with the arrow pointing to the right. Now I see that my new view includes Book. Let's go back and look at the Select tab now. On the left now we have our available tables and views, as well as the columns, which we can select. So let's pick a few of these columns. Under the Book table, let's pick Book Identification. Notice the buttons that light up. How about also Book Name? Oh, we can't control click. I have only two choices. I can send these items selected on the left over to the right, one at a time or all at once. So Book Identification, and push the single right pointing arrow. Book Name. Oh, how about Book Type? So our view now has three view columns, the ones we see on the left. They're no longer available. In other words, they have been selected. The From tab hasn't changed. On the Where tab, we have nothing. Irwin won't fill this in for you. We just don't know what we would want here. Irwin can't predict. Let's take a look at the SQL tab. And you'll see that our DDL script, our SQL, is beginning. Create a view, V underbar book. And it lists our view columns as, and it tells us we're selecting these from the book table and the names of the base columns. Okay, well, that's how to create a new view, and we can flesh it out. But let's take a deeper look into views that we've already created. The list at the top, I'm going to switch over to V Author Privacy. Take a look at the Select tab. This is another single table view. The purpose of it was to protect the private information of the authors. From. Anything in the Where? No. And our SQL is what we'd expect, the Create and the Select. Now let's look at V Publisher Book and the From tab. We see that this view has two base tables, Publisher and Book. On the Select tab, we can see the columns in our view. We have 3 from Publisher and 3 from Book. And Where? Let's see if we've got, yes we do. We have a tiny little where clause. Book.booktype equals, in single quotes, sci-fi, S-C-I, capital F-I. We want this view just to present selected information about any books that have a book type equal to sci-fi. We could type in all this information, but let me show you something interesting about the SQL tab. Notice whenever we click the SQL tab, everything's selected already. That just reminds me that we can do interesting things here. For example, in the Select clause, I can find the column that I'm interested in, the base table column, book.booktype, highlight it, right-click, select Copy, go back to my Where clause, and right-click and paste right here. It's not so much a labor-saving device as it is a way to make sure that we get exactly the same thing every place. It's especially important in the Where clause because it's got to be entered. Irwin is not going to put this in here for us automatically. Also on the Where tab, we see other DBMS-specific clauses. Group by. This is a SQL Server 2016 model, by the way. And having. There's another choice for SQL, and that is user-defined SQL. In order to type anything in here and have it actually accepted and used, we'd have to check that box up at the top right corner of the tab, user-defined SQL. And we can type in or paste in our SQL. The only challenge is then whatever's on our SQL tab won't be used. So changes on other tabs, like our From tab or our Select tab, will no longer affect the SQL tab once we have decided to use user-defined SQL. And there's lots of other tabs on this editor, just as we've seen in the other editors. We can associate a style, meaning we can override this inheritance of theme from the diagram down to the individual objects and so forth. We can associate an icon with this view. Enter a comment, specify the order in which these objects have to be created. Irwin ordinarily does a very good job of that on its own, but you might have some specific requirements. We'll skip the UDP tab. There's a History tab. This is automatically entered. A Notes tab. An Extended Notes tab. So there's lots of opportunities to gather metadata here. If for some reason there's metadata that you would like to track but Irwin does not provide for, we have the UDP tab, User Defined Properties, and we're going to dig into those in another course. Okay, well, I don't really want my VBook view that we built up there. So I'm going to select it and do something we haven't done in a guided editor before. Delete it. Boop. And now close the guided editor for views. And we're back here. Terrific. The view editor may be my favorite Irwin DM editor. Maybe it's because you can see the DDL develop as you work. Also, the fact that the editor's structure follows the DDL syntax makes it easy to work with. We will wrap up this course by covering the Irwin Data Modeler Help menu. Now that you have some understanding of Irwin Data Modeler, let's review the contents available via the Help system. Many times this is the fastest way to resolve a question relating to Irwin DM. We have seen context-sensitive help in Irwin Data Modeler pretty much everywhere we've looked. These toolbars in the panes, except for the Overview pane, have a Help button, and they take us right to context-sensitive help. So the Explorer, the Model Explorer pane, we click on its toolbar, we see how the Model Explorer works. If we click on the Help button in the toolbar for the action log down here at the bottom left, where I have mine docked, it tells us about the action log pane. Similarly, in the guided editors, for example, for table properties, there's a Help button. And these are once again going to take us to context-sensitive help. All of these context-sensitive help screens we've seen so far have a backwards and a forward button at the top, a number of links related to what we're looking at, and a panel on the left shows us where we are in relationship to the whole context. All of these toolbar buttons take us to context-sensitive help. Now let's take a look at the Help menu. Help, Help Topics, Understanding Your Support, etc. You see the Help Topics are grouped in 4 sections. Help Topics is uppermost. Let's start there. And this is the top, if you will, of Irwin's online help. In fact, that's what it tells us, online help. It's not context sensitive. Let's take a look at that left panel now. We have 2 tabs, Contents and Search. On the Contents tab, we see the familiar list of sections in the Virtual Help book. Getting started, creating models. If we open up creating models, we see creating a logical model, creating a physical model. And under creating a logical model, there are entities, attributes, key groups, and so forth. So very hierarchical. On the Search tab, click up at the top, you can type in a keyword or a phrase. For example, I'll type macro commands and go. Macros, a sequence of simpler instructions and so forth, over 190 predefined macro commands. This is the capability that amazes new users of Irwin Data Modeler. And notice that macros is a link. Click on that, and we get some tremendous help on macros. So that's how the Search tab works. Notice the link at the top of the Search tab. Click here to search the bookshelf. And also on the Contents tab, we see way up the top, Back to Bookshelf, which is a link. The Irwin Bookshelf link leads us to broad and deep coverage of the tool. The bookshelf is a huge collection of documentation about Irwin Data Modeler. Everything from the product documentation to release information. Product documentation organized several different ways, by function, by user role. information about product support, including a link to get a license, a link to the website, Irwin Data Modeler's social media, articles by expert bloggers, a collection of white papers, Irwin customer success stories, and other Irwin tools and products. Let me close the Irwin bookshelf. Let's take a look at the second group of choices here under the Help menu. Understanding your support takes you to the Irwin Incorporated website, with choices, of course, in the support menu. Overall support looks like this. The knowledge base, licensing, the user community, terrific, video library, or the ability to contact support, open tickets, and so forth. Let me close that. Back to the Help menu. Our second selection in that second group, technical support, takes you directly to the support site. From the Help menu now, education, the next choice. This jumps directly to a page that describes the training resources for Irwin Data Modeler. Back to the menu, Irwin Customer Community. I urge everyone with an interest in Irwin Data Modeler or any of the other Irwin products to take advantage of the community here. Under Irwin DM, we have a number of subdivisions here. Good stuff. Irwin Data Modeler has always had a very active user community. And licensing is the last choice in the second group under the Help menu. This gives you licensing information about your particular installation. The bottom sections of this dialog let you manage your license right here. Click on the button below to return the license. So if you want to hand the license back in, your license, so that somebody else in your organization can use it, you can do that. You can do an offline deactivation, check out long-term, and there's even a reminder when your license is about to expire. So lots of licensing information here. And now our third group, if you will, or just a single selection here. What's new? As you would expect, this pulls up a list of new features, new capabilities, changes in the latest release of the tool. And this page, like every page, asks you to rate its content, and if you have any comments about the usefulness of this page or the information on it. Finally, from the Help menu, About Irwin Data Modeler, the very bottom choice. Here's where we find information about the particular version of Irwin Data Modeler you're using. This is a Workgroup Edition for 64-bit release. This is actually 9.8 that we're looking at here. System information, tech support, third-party notices, just kind of typical in an About screen. Lots of wonderful stuff. A huge collection of documentation about Irwin Data Modeler. Remember the bookshelf? Everything from release notes to articles by expert bloggers and white papers and introductions to other Irwin products. Terrific help capabilities in Irwin DM. So that's it. It's not rocket science, but it's important to understand the resources available to assist in using Irwin DM. In summary, you should now have a solid understanding of Irwin Data Modeler's guided editors. Also, the concepts of model, subject areas, diagrams, and themes, along with some usage tips, and the help system should now be very familiar to you. Congratulations on completing this course. We encourage you to build your Irwin Data Modeler knowledge by completing the series of Irwin DM tool training courses. Thanks for participating.